Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being at the museum tonight for the first in our special anniversary program series that we're doing in conjunction with our special interactive art installation, River of Time, in partnership with Faith and Grief. And the artist is here tonight, Pamela Nelson. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And I also want to recognize tomorrow's speaker, who is here tonight, taking notes in the corner over there, Dr. Tony Glover, who was an assassination eyewitness right out here at the corner of Houston and Elm on November 22nd, 1963. She'll be right up here on this stage tomorrow at 6:30 for a special conversation, her first program here at the Sixth Floor Museum. But tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. James Pennebaker. I first met Jamie Pennebaker more than 15 years ago when I was studying the institutional history of the Sixth Floor Museum, and I was deeply fascinated by his studies regarding the emotional impact of President Kennedy's assassination and its legacy here in Dallas. His initial study in conjunction with the Dallas County Historical Foundation became mainstream news at the 25th anniversary of the assassination in 1988, mirroring local media's emphasis on community reflection at the quarter-century mark. The Dallas Morning News article on Dr. Pennebaker's work from November 1988, titled "JFK's Death Still Haunts Dallasites," was just the beginning. For years, well beyond the release of Oliver Stone's film JFK in the early 90s, he served as the go-to academic on the impact of the Kennedy assassination, making him perhaps the only social psychologist to ever appear on Entertainment Tonight. Dr. James W. Pennebaker is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin and a member of the Academy of Distinguished Teachers. Over the course of his career, he has studied the nature of physical symptoms, health consequences of secrets, expressive writing, and natural language, and has received grants from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the U.S. Army Research Institute, and other federal agencies for studies in language, emotion, and social dynamics. Earlier this year, he was elected president of the Association for Psychological Science. Dr. Pennebaker is author or editor of 12 books and more than 300 articles. And in 1997, the Sixth Floor Museum was honored to receive the Dr. Jamie Pennebaker Collection, comprised of research material and raw data from his study of the Kennedy assassination. It is an honor to welcome Dr. Pennebaker to the museum tonight to discuss his fascinating work that remains more than 35 years after the opening of the Sixth Floor Museum, such an important part of our own institutional history. Please join me in welcoming Jamie Pennebaker.
Thank you. That was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. It's such an honor to be here. I can't tell you how great it is. I have a long connection with Dallas. My father actually was born here. I grew up in Midland, and those of you who don't know Midland has always considered itself a suburb of Dallas, even though it's 340 miles away. I grew up on the Dallas Morning News and had the good fortune to end up at SMU teaching in the psychology department for 14 years between 1983 and 1997. In any case, the Kennedy assassination haunted me, as it did, looking around the room, haunted many of the people in this room. And today what I'd like to do is to talk with you about some of the things that I discovered over the years about the Kennedy assassination and its effect on Dallas, and also what role the building of the museum had on Dallas and the people here as well. Now, as I begin, let me jump ahead to my research. So I got my PhD in social psychology from the University of Texas. My early area of research dealt with emotions and physical symptoms and how people come to know how they feel. One thing led to another, and I came across a finding that had a profound effect on me. I discovered that people who reported having a traumatic sexual experience prior to the age of 17 had far more health problems than people who didn't. Well, and that wasn't particularly shocking because we kind of knew that. But I was curious, what was so powerful about a traumatic sexual experience? And it turns out, part of it, it was secret. And later on, I started to do other research, and this research was done here at SMU, where we canvassed a large group of adults, asking them about different types of traumatic experiences that they had had in their lives. And then if they had had that trauma, did they talk to others about it? And what we found was, it didn't matter what the trauma was. The important issue is if a person had a trauma and kept it secret, keeping it secret made it a far more toxic trauma than if you talk to other people about it. So this started to get me thinking about, well, if a trauma is so bad for you that you keep secret, what if we brought people in the laboratory and had them talk about it or perhaps write about it? Well, it turned out having people talk about it was too much, was too complex because, you know, who would listen, et cetera. So instead, we ended up doing a study. And the first study was done with SMU students, where we brought these students into our experiment, and they were asked if they would give permission for us to analyze their student health center records, and they all agreed. And then people, by a flip of the coin, were asked to either write about a major emotional upheaval in their lives, ideally one that they hadn't talked about, or to write about superficial topics. And they were supposed to do it for 4 days, 15 minutes a day, and they did it in our laboratories. So the experiment on the surface sounds fairly simple. And the people who were asked to write about traumas, we basically said, for the next 4 days, I want you to write about the deepest, most upsetting experience of your entire life. And in your writing, I want you to really let go and explore your deepest emotions and thoughts. Ideally, this should be something that you've not talked to other people in any detail. Now, you may never have had a trauma, but all of us have had major conflicts or stressors, and you can write about those as well. But whatever you choose, I want you to really let go and explore them. That was it, and they wrote for 4 days, and the other group wrote about these superficial topics. We then essentially sat back and waited for several months, and then we got the records, the student health center records of the students. And what we did was to compare how often they went to the doctor for illness in the months before the experiment with the months afterwards. And what we found was that people who wrote about the emotional upheavals ended up going to the student health center at half the rate as people in the control conditions. Now that study was stunning for me because I had done that study kind of on spec. I wasn't sure it would really work. And then I did a second study. This second time I worked with immunologists. We drew blood from people before they were assigned to condition, after the last day of writing, and then 6 weeks afterwards. And we found similar things, that people who wrote about these traumatic experiences had enhanced immune function, and they also went to the doctor at lower rates. Now, those two studies were published in the mid-'80s. And since that time, there have now been about 2,000 studies done using this method that's called expressive writing. And what's so intriguing about it is, not only does it improve people's physical health, it also is associated with improvements in mental health, and it's also associated with changes in how people connect with others. So that was the background to the next part of my story. In about 1986, Linda Lynn Adams and Conover Hunt had come up with this crazy idea to make the 6th floor into a museum. And many of you already know the history, but one thing that happened was, after the assassination, the city of Dallas really struggled with what to do with this building. There was one group of people who just wanted to tear it down and erase it from our memories. And another group says, no, we need to do something about it. And so, as all good bureaucracies are, they did nothing with it for years. And what they ultimately ended up doing was turning it into the county administration building. So Conover and Lindeland came and they spoke to the dean, Hal Williams at SMU, and asked Hal, anybody at SMU be interested in studying something like this? And Hal thought of me because I was kind of a nut job compared to many others. He'll study anything. And he introduced me to them, and we hit it off immediately. And what was interesting about this was, even though I didn't appreciate the depths of it, what was going on with Dallas was not that dissimilar than what I'd been studying in the laboratory in terms of traumas and secrets. And I'd had some interesting experiences. I moved here in 1983, so exactly 20 years after the assassination. I also had, I don't think you're allowed to give a talk here unless you tell people your personal experience about the Kennedy assassination, and I know you're dying to know mine. Well, I'm glad you asked, because in Midland, was in PE class, and PE class was over, and I was waiting around for the next class, and we had all been told that Kennedy had been assassinated and he was dead, and I was kind of curious, and so I spoke to a girl I had known my whole life who knew nothing about national politics. She was, but she was in tears, and she said, "I hate Dallas. I'm ashamed to be a Texan." And I remember thinking, "Oh, that doesn't make any sense." And then ironically, after I got involved in this project, at our 25th high school reunion, I asked her, "Do you remember what you said after the Kennedy assassination?" She has no idea, and I told her. Yep, she had no memory of it at all. And here it had been seared in my brain. 20 years later, my wife Ruth and I, Ruth is right there, we moved here, and by then we had our first child, Teal, who was a year and a half. Ruth had a job with the Dallas Morning News as soon as we got here. We got here before the university started, and before there was we had a daycare slot for our daughter. So our 1.5-year-old daughter and I traveled all around Austin. We visited different places, and I thought, I should go to the 6th floor and see the grassy knoll, and never seen that. So I remember going to, outside the door or out front, and I'm looking for all the signs. I'm going up and down, and all these people from all over the world were walking up and down, trying to figure out where the Texas Book Depository was, and it just said the county administration building, and there was nothing. So I thought, well, hell. So I went inside, and there was an elevator. So I got on the elevator, pushed the button up to 6, and it only went up to number 2. That was odd. So I went and started knocking on doors, and finally somebody opened it, and you could tell he was really annoyed, another person. I said, "I'm trying to get to the 6th floor. How do I do that?" "Well, you can't do this. The elevator stops at 2. Essentially, get out." So that was my introduction. And I go outside, and I'm thinking, this is so odd that, one thing by the way, I love Dallas, but Dallas is famous for being pretty greedy, and if there's a way to make a buck, people would. You would think that somebody would be making a buck off of this, because there were all of these tourists walking up and down. But instead, there was this invisible sign that said, "Nothing happened here. Go to South Fork." For those of you above the age of, or below the age of 60, that refers to the TV show Dallas, and it takes place which was the most popular show on television for a while. In any case, so that was part of it. Oh, by the way, here's what I'm going to be talking about today. By the way, I have a great number of slides with all sorts of graphs and so forth. And Ruth and that little girl, Teal, who was 1.5, who is now 42 years old, said, "Oh God, don't do graphs." And I said, "Well, I love graphs." And no graphs. I have graphs at the end of this, so if after I finish, you want to see all the graphs, I will sit with you and go through them with you. They're great. Anyway, so what I want to just talk about is we've already gone through the first background in Dallas a little bit before and after. We'll talk more and more, and that's what we're going to talk about. Okay. Exactly. So Dallas seemed to be avoiding the whole discussion of the Kennedy assassination. And one other place that I almost kind of love this, immediately after the assassination in 1964, a group of people in Dallas started to raise money for some kind of memorial. And so they spoke with Jackie Kennedy and others, and they were able to commission Philip Johnson to do the John F. Kennedy Memorial. And Johnson, one would not call him a person who exhibits warmth and softness. And so the memorial that they agreed on was this. Now, I kind of love this because, you know, I find it the most cold, horrifying exhibit I've ever seen. Now, I don't want to offend anybody, but it is a box, and it basically says, "Don't ask what happened here. We're going to keep what happened here in this box, and don't open the box." But this was kind of what was going on with Dallas, that there was this active avoidance of the Kennedy assassination. Why did it happen? Well, I had done some other studies looking at natural disasters, and one that was relevant was the Loma Prieta earthquake. This was a Bay Area earthquake that occurred in 1989, and working with Kent Harbor, a student at Stanford, we became interested in how people in San Francisco versus other cities reacted to it. And we discovered that with most major traumatic experiences, people's reactions go through different stages. Initially, people talk about it all the time. They talk with each other. They want to hear what other people's stories. They tell their own stories. And then usually about 3 or 4 weeks afterwards, people still want to tell their stories, but they're sick of hearing other people's stories. And what that does is it results in kind of this conspiracy of silence, that people stop talking about it. And I am sure that's what happened in Dallas, that initially everybody wanted to hear everybody else's stories, but hearing other people's stories is really stressful. And everybody soon agrees, let's not talk about this anymore. Plus, the people in Dallas were undergoing all sorts of fairly horrifying experiences. For example, we've, in our studies and also just meeting people, there have been lots of stories. One that I always found interesting, this family went on vacation in the summer in '64. They stopped at a restaurant in Florida. They went in, the waitress asked, "Where are you guys from?" They said, "Dallas." And the waitress went in, and the manager came out and said, "You're from Dallas? You must leave now. We will not serve anybody from Dallas." Or people who would make long-distance phone calls. Back then, all phone calls were made by an operator. Operators often would find out that one of the two people was from Dallas, and they just unplugged the phone call. Or we know several people who went to college at universities, at schools outside of Texas, and they were hectored and badgered by other students when they found out they were from Dallas. And these kids often would then transfer to another university and tell people that they were from Houston just to be safe. But so these stories all come together to suggest that there was a lot of shame going on for people in Dallas. Now, I ended up working with Conover and Lindeland to do some surveys initially, just to get a sense of how were people thinking about the Kennedy assassination? How would they react to the building of the 6th floor? So we did random dialing, and we got 200 people from Dallas and another 200 people from 50 people each from Memphis, which was a really nice control city because Martin Luther King had been killed 5 years afterwards. And then also we used Fort Worth and Columbus, Ohio, and Houston as controls. And what was interesting was about half the people that we interviewed were over the age of 30. And at the time we were doing this, we made this distinction between people over 30 versus under 30, because people who were over 30 were probably at least 7 years old when Kennedy was assassinated, and the people under 30 weren't. And then we had one other group in there, and these were transplants to Dallas who had moved to Dallas after Kennedy had been shot. And we asked them a series of questions. One of them, how much do you blame Dallas for the assassination? And it turns out the group that blamed them the most were the Dallas people who were under the age of 30. To what degree do you think other people blame Dallas? The people who were over 30 who lived in Dallas overwhelmingly felt that other people around the world blamed them. The other groups didn't feel that as much. Another one was, if you were able to walk through the 6th floor, would you do this? The group that said they'd want to do it the most were the Dallas residents under the age of 30, and the people who would least like it were the people over 30 who lived in Dallas. And then one other question. In the last year, how many times have you thought about the Kennedy assassination? Now keep in mind, this is 22, 23 years after that. All the groups, the average was about maybe 6 times. The people who are native Dallasites over the age of 30 was 17 times. And when we would interview people who were over 30 often would talk about just seeing the 6th floor made them sick to their stomach, that it was difficult for them to even drive downtown and avert their eyes. It was still weighing on people. Now, standing back, if this was we know for individuals, you have a trauma and you keep it secret, you're more prone to health problems. And my research had found every kind of health problem imaginable. If we went in and we looked at just health statistics from the National Center for Health Statistics and other locations, would there be differences, say, in heart disease deaths in Dallas versus other cities such as Houston? And the answer is yes, that deaths due to heart disease increased about 4 to 8% for Dallas residents relative to Houston and also the rest of the United States. By the way, there was that same drop for Memphis, but in the years after the assassination of Martin Luther King in Memphis, their heart disease deaths went up. Now, the length of time that the heart disease deaths were elevated in Dallas was about 2 to 3 years. Another thing that we looked at was suicide. Suicide rates in the 2 years after the assassination went up 20% in Dallas, and they were essentially unchanged in Houston and the rest of the United States. Murder rates also went up. In other words, mental health and physical health effects were very clear in the Dallas residents. This was a low-level cumulative stressor in the community. And it was also interesting that both, in addition to suicide, and murder rates also went up, suggesting depression, but also more interpersonal conflict. One of the other interesting issues is Dallas behaved when this happened. One thing that often happens when people have some kind of upsetting experience is they will put their mind to some task, and they may actually be very effective in doing that. And this was something that happened in Dallas. So there were some very interesting positive things. For example, In the years afterwards, the number of very large buildings increased at a very high rate in Dallas relative to Houston, even though economically the cities were doing equally well. Dallas put in far more money in parks than they had in the past and in other, compared to Houston and elsewhere. And one of the most interesting, we were able to get statistics from United Way in terms of donations. Right after the Kennedy assassination, the donations to United Way increased about 30% compared to Houston, the United States. And this lasted until 1968. And after 1968, Dallas went back to normal, or to its baseline. And I've always felt that was because in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated and Robert Kennedy, and I think Dallas collectively went, whew, you know, now it's not all just on us. In other words, so there were all of these cultural changes that were going on. Now this brings up another issue about the nature of memory. One of the things that was interesting, you know, I'm really pleased that Stephen brought up that I was on Entertainment Tonight. Really kind of the high point of my career. And I was interviewed by, this was all actually surrounding not just the opening of the museum, but the JFK movie. And let me just check. Oh yeah, all the time in the world. Oh my God, where was I going with this? Yes, JFK. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I knew I was. So this was Entertainment Tonight, being interviewed by reporters, and I was interviewed by a reporter from the Sacramento Bee, and he was saying, you know, it's kind of weird. I've been looking. This is 25 years later. You know, there's nothing named after John F. Kennedy in Dallas. There's no schools, there's no streets, there's no anything. And he said, but it seems like there's a lot of stuff named after Martin Luther King. And there was, and I found, wow, that is interesting. So I did some analysis of Memphis. There were all sorts of things named after John F. Kennedy, nothing named after Martin Luther King. In other words, both of the cities are doing the same thing. Something bad happens, let's just paper over this and focus on other things. And in fact, I was looking up Kennedy Street, and there was a Kennedy Street in Dallas up until 1963, and then after the Kennedy assassination, they changed the name of Kennedy Street. So again, this is nothing odd about Dallas. This is the way humans are. We were trying to avoid reminders of this. Now this brings us to the museum. Why in the world did we finally build a museum here? I became interested in this because it was essentially 25 years after the assassination that Dallas was now about to build and open the 6th floor. And then I started to wonder, well, what about other times? When do we build monuments? And so I went and I was able to get about 100 different monuments in the United States that had been built over the previous 150 years. And what was fascinating was, if something happened, if it wasn't built, if there wasn't a monument built in the first 4 to 8 years, there wouldn't be one until about 25 to 30 years afterwards. And then, if there's not one built then it's not until about 50 to 60 years afterwards. And if not then, maybe 75 to 80 years, maybe a little bit after 100. What's going on? Well, there have now been a number of really intriguing studies. If you ask people of any generation to list their favorite songs, their songs are the songs that they listen to between the ages of 13 and 25. If you ask about most important memories, it's between the ages of 13 and 25. Linda Lynn Adams, Conover Hunt, and I, all of us were born in that time window. The people, so there's a real traumatic event that occurs. If you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, your view is, let's move on. Let's keep going forward. We don't need to deal with this. But those kids 13 to 15, they can't get it out of their heads. They are thinking about it and reliving it. And they are the ones, once they get the capital in their lives, they're the ones who build the monuments or the museums. The same thing is true with movies. I was fascinated that the first really well-known movie about the Kennedy assassination was Oliver Stone's JFK. Now that might, there's some people in the room like me were appalled by it, but it doesn't matter. That movie came out and it had a very big impact. So I looked the same thing and found maybe 100 movies that were made about something, and then when the movie came out versus when the event that it was depicting happened. And what the curve is will bring tears to you curve people. This is going to bring tears to your eyes. Hardly anything until starting about 20 years, peaking about 25, 27, 28 years, and then it drops. In other words, invest in a 9/11 movie because it's going to be coming out soon. So we know, and again, all of these things are suggestive of this age cohort. So once these directors and producers are in this, get to they're old enough and have resources to make the movies, they will, about the issues that are most important for them. So this brings me to kind of the next broad issue. The museum opened. What did it do? Did it have any long-term effects? In terms of disease, in terms of anything like that, I haven't seen anything. But I think it had a profound psychological effect on the city of Dallas. All of a sudden, there was no need to keep the secret anymore. There was also the other thing that I've always been fascinated. You know, I had never thought about museums in my entire life until Lindelin and Conover contacted me. And now I've become a real aficionado about what makes for a good museum. And one way you can know it's a good museum is you hang around the door as people are leaving. In the first few years after this was open, I would come down here occasionally, and I'd just hang around the door outside and listen to what people were talking about. And it was amazing how frequently the people were walking out and somebody would be talking about their memories or they're hearing their parents talk about it. They were socially connecting about that. And by the way, I would urge all of you to start listening. You know, when you go to a movie, what do people talk about when they're leaving? When you go to an art museum or anything, what are they talking about? Because what they're doing is putting that experience into words, and my research certainly suggests, putting things into words is a really powerful, healing kind of way of structuring experience. Now, there's some very interesting questions about the future of the 6th floor. This museum, I think, is phenomenal. Every time I come here, I feel so proud to have been a part of it, and my part was really minimal compared to all the other people who created it and have been maintaining it over the years. But my generation, we have limited half-life, and what happens when we go? Well, the next generation will be our kids, and how much do our kids really know about the Kennedy assassination? Some of our kids do. I'm not sure ours do. And what about our grandkids? I guarantee you that it has not much meaning for them. And what kinds of museums are able to have long-term impact? Ford Theater is a good comparison. And it's kind of interesting, Pearl Harbor but the issue is how do we keep kind of this memory alive. And this is going to be, I think, a fascinating and important issue in the years ahead. And also, I know that this has been a major museum or sightseeing place for people to come to Dallas. How will the leadership over the next, this is going to be the next several years, think about that. So that's my story. That here was a horrifying event for the city of Dallas. It was traumatic for the people. The people here didn't want to talk about it. And psychologically, it was very difficult to do so. It had measurable health impacts, psychological impacts, and but also there were some beneficial things that came from it as well. And I think ever since it's been built, that it has been a real healing event in the history of the city of Dallas. So let me stop here and open this up for questions.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
You did this survey. After the deaths of RFK and MLK, did you do a survey on LA and...
So it's very interesting. It had no effect on LA. And I think part of it is LA is this incredibly diverse world that people are moving and coming and going. There's not the same kind of group in one place. There was clearly a similar thing in Memphis. McKinley, where was McKinley shot? Buffalo, yeah. I guess that there was probably something similar in Buffalo. So I do think it depends on the city. Yes?
Have you done a study of the 9/11 museum? What there was, that's pretty intense, but immediately they're like never forget.
So the question is have I done any research on the 9/11 museum? And you point out how powerful it was. And that one's an interesting one because they put that up almost immediately compared to others. I have not done any research on it, and it would be I guarantee you that somebody is. But that is a really interesting one because it went up so quickly. And I think part of it is that when there wasn't a sense of shame, and there was something really different. Remember, I didn't even get into this, but as everybody remembers, Dallas was dubbed the city of hate. Not exactly the kind of, you're not going to put that on an ad campaign. Yeah. Yeah.
I was in New York City, and my accent's a little neutral now, but I am a native Texan.
No, whoa.
And people would ask me, where are you from? And I'd say, well, I'm from Texas. And I'm actually from Lubbock. And they'd say, so what? And they say, aren't you really from Dallas?
Yeah.
And finally, I just started saying, I am from Dallas, Texas. Bring it on. Now, I'm a big guy, and I can handle myself and whatever, but it was different.
Yes.
Exactly. No one treats Los Angeles or Memphis or anywhere else, but the overall dislike of Texas.
That's right. And what was interesting about that, and I actually ended up going to Europe when I was 14, so it was the year afterwards. And people had asked where I was from, and I said, Midland didn't really ring any bells, so I just say Texas. And I remember several people, bang, bang, Kennedy. But the difference was, I remember, in 88, 89, or when would it have been? No, it would have been in the early 80s, going to Australia for a talk, and people asking, and I said I'm from Dallas, and they got very excited. We love JR. It was almost as though that, together with the Dallas Cowboys, kind of helped scrub the. That's right. Yeah.
Did the political identity of Texas have an influence on that?
Okay. This is another thing we looked at. So this might surprise you, but Dallas in the early 60s was conservative. And it was extremely conservative, and it typically voted, it was something like 23 points more conservative than the state did in general. Starting in 64, it moved to only being 7%, 7 points more conservative than the rest of the state, and that never got any higher afterwards. So I think it had a profound effect on kind of this sense of the entire populace kind of pulling back from its kind of extremism from before. Yeah.
I've got two things. The Dallas Cowboys, just after it happened, there was a threat that they were going to be shot while they were playing. There was a threat that someone was going to shoot them during the match.
Oh, that's interesting. So this was just brought up
I think.
that right soon after the assassination, that the Dallas Cowboy team was threatened that they'd be shot. Yeah.
And another thing, because lots of people who were there have actually spoken in this building. Do you think that's helped them?
I would bet that it has, and I would defer to Stephen about that. In other words, would you say that having people talk about their experience has been beneficial for them?
I think certainly. In doing the oral history project, just sitting across from somebody, asking them to share a very dark moment from their life has helped them, I think, to maybe process some trauma they didn't even know they had, residual trauma from 1963.
It was a big deal.
Yeah.
And I was, well, Becca says I was in third grade, I say I was in fourth grade. But it was a big deal, and we would go on trips, and of course he was a lot younger. People really reacted viscerally to you when you said you were from Dallas.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a lot of shame.
Yeah. Yes.
I have more comment than question. I remember, I was born after '63, but I remember as a young teenager in the early '80s, after, I remember especially the attempt on Ronald Reagan's life at that time. And it was rare to see live newscasts because it was prior to CNN and all that 24-hour news. Of course, no internet. But the broadcaster, they were announcing things as information came in, and it said there was some connection to John Hinckley being from Dallas.
Oh, that's right.
Just a discussion like Dallas, but it's like the newscaster couldn't help himself. He
Yes.
just-
What was just pointed out was that she was listening to coverage of the assassination attempt on Reagan, and that it was announced that Hinckley was from Dallas, and the newscaster said dismissively, "Dallas." It's kind of like, isn't that typical? And shook his head, yeah. Yeah.
So have you ever looked at the issue, because you always hear the Kennedys didn't come back to Dallas? Did you ever look at what the trauma was for them, or what the impact if they would have come back, or anything related to that?
I can't, I have no knowledge of the Kennedys' response or long term. I know our CEO here was talking about some of the people.
Yes, we have had some members of the extended Kennedy family come here. We don't say who they are, but over the years we've worked very hard to instill trust and respect from Boston.
Yes. So,
Just some not tawdry institutions dealing in conspiracies.
yeah. So the Kennedy family was very nervous about the way that things would be presented, and the ones who have visited have been really appreciative that it hasn't been. Yeah.
I don't know if this tracks, but how would you all do research on something like the pandemic, where a collective trauma that the entire world experienced, and if you don't have those cities that didn't have that kind of thing, but trying to figure out what the health and mental health differences are because of this collective trauma?
So the question is, how do you study something like COVID, which affected every place. As it happens, my team has done a huge amount of research on COVID using the social media site Reddit. And what's really interesting from a research perspective is what we're able to do is to get day by day rates about how people in different communities are talking. And we were able to also see in towns where there is a very high infection rate and death rate, and compare that with towns that don't have that until a few months later. And so you're able to start to see to what degree does the uniqueness of the community contribute versus the national media as well. So there are so many interesting projects that are coming out of this in terms of better understanding how people are talking, how they're thinking about it on a day-by-day basis. In our study, we are essentially tracking over 1 million people, tens of millions of posts, day by day, and we're actually able to follow that cohort from 2011 until when they essentially shut it down in 2023 in terms of for researchers. Yes?
How do you think the conspiracy theories surround the assassination and the upcoming release of all of the Warren Commission's documents will keep the interest of generations down the road?
So this is a really interesting question, and that is kind of the nature of conspiracy theories. And so the first thing is it's really important to appreciate every big event will incite conspiracy theories. The bigger the event, the bigger people. It's kind of a law of cause and effect. If there is a big effect, there must have been a big cause. And I think any simple explanation is never satisfying. And the question is, well, what will happen when the Warren report is finally released? Will that change the nature of conspiracy theories? I guarantee you that it's not going to change anything. In fact, it's probably going to incite more conspiracy theories, even if it says, yes, the CIA met secretly for several months and were working with their good friends Fidel Castro and the mob, and even then people say, I knew that they would cover it up.
Do you think your grandchildren will be interested in Kennedy because of the
well, my grandchildren will only be interested in it if they are into conspiracy theories. Here's another interesting issue in some of the research I've done. I started looking at this with anti-vax conspiracies. This was before COVID. And what was interesting about this, I was interested in who starts believing anti-vax things for measles, mumps, etc., and tying it to autism. And so I was working at Microsoft Research, where we had access to all of these Twitter accounts, and we could find when somebody started to talk about anti-vax things, and then go in the past to see, did they have some kind of traumatic experience? Maybe they had a new child or whatever. What we found was these people had posted dozens, hundreds of posts about, government, the government was doing this, the oil business was doing that. They had a long history of conspiracy theories. So I think there's kind of a conspiracy theory personality that plays into this. Not always, but I think often.
Jenny, did anybody doing research, either you or someone else, discern resentment on the part of Dallas people because the assassin wasn't indigenous?
No.
Logically. I mean, the events that preceded the assassination, I think, probably had an enormous effect on why people thought Dallas was the culprit.
So the question is did anybody ever question the idea that Dallas was at fault, since the guy who did the shooting wasn't a native Dallasite? Details, details, details. Keep in mind, here you have, evidence in the past that Dallas has been nasty to Adlai Stevenson, LBJ, etc. But there was a bigger issue. Dallas was a rich city, really full of itself. Isn't that typical? And so I think it was very easy for others to, they had a stereotype of Dallas. And Dallas was also living with the Dallas myth of being, a Western power that was, too big for its britches. That is I will not publish that, but that was, I think there's some truth to that. Yeah, that's not scientific terminology. Anything else? Yes?
You talk about the cycle of when we build museums and when we build monuments. A lot of attention in the last couple of years about Civil War monuments. Have you looked at the social psychology that's going on in decommissioning and moving Civil War monuments?
So I haven't studied the decommissioning part, but the Civil War monuments are, again, as a social psychologist perspective, fascinating. There were no Civil War monuments put up in the 1800s. They didn't start being put up until the 20s and 30s. Soon after the Klan movie, Birth of a Nation. And there were no Lee high schools until civil rights was passed. So a lot of all of this gets into the world of kind of collective memory. And there's a whole field in psychology and sociology looking at this idea of how groups of people come to believe something. And that was what was so interesting about Oliver Stone's movie, that overnight he comes up with this idea that the CIA must have been behind it, and national polls over the next 15 or 20 years, it got to the point that I believe a majority of people believe the CIA may have been involved. How does that happen? And I think part of it is the way people communicate with each other. A book that I would recommend, it's by Harari. This is the guy who wrote *Sapiens*. He has a book that's called *Nexus*, and the book's okay. It's not great, but the underlying thesis of it is really interesting, and that is the nature of social communication, and that as social communication expands, people now have more information, and you would think that means that people would generally be able to make better decisions. And he essentially tracks social communication going back from when we were cave people to from just naming things to telling stories to the birth of general language and translation to writing it down to etc. And he points out, as we look at every advancement in communication, there are these cases where the people become much smarter, collectively smarter, making better machines and so forth, and also occasionally becoming increasingly stupid. So, for example, he lays the witch hunts and the Spanish Inquisition at the feet of the printing press. That here it was bringing all of these good things, but it allowed for rumors and so forth to appear to be true, and they ran through cultures. So, it's all good, it's all bad. Okay, let me just, there's that, here we are. And by the way, there is a great plaque on this. And the plaque was written in 1981, and it deals with the building, and it essentially, there's a long first paragraph. You know, in 1888, blah, 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 and you know, it passed from this person to that person. They built the place, blah, 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 second paragraph. Oh, then it burned down, the second paragraph. And then in 1937, this person bought it, and, blah, 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 and it ended up becoming, you know, the school book depository. The last two-sentence paragraph. On November 22nd, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly shot President Kennedy, and that's it. Which is that, you know, it was 1981. It was kind of like, some people would call that, there's some newspaper people here, burying the lead. Okay. So I want to just thank Linda Lynn and Conover Hunt. Rhonda Polikoff, who was one of my students at SMU at the time, was really helpful in bringing this together. And I also want to thank SMU. I think SMU is a really fine university. I was really proud to be a part of it. It's a really good school. And then a lot of this was funded by all sorts of things. And if you'd like to email me, just email me. And if you'd like to see these really cool slides, here's what they look like. Ooh, ooh, yeah. Ooh. Oh, oh. Okay. Oh, let's look at. I love that.
What was the slide? Large buildings?
Yeah, a number of large buildings. So just showing that Dallas all of a sudden kicks in and starts trying to build large buildings. This is the years after the event. Tears, I know, you're thinking, that's too beautiful to be true. That's for the movies. There it is. Oh, and this is other stuff that's really cool.
That's just cruel.
Well, no, you email me. See, if I had put all those up, I would have had to explain it. You know, somebody over here would say, excuse me, is that statistically significant? And somebody over here would have said, exactly what kind of analyses did you use? Well, I'm glad you asked, I would say. Anyway, thank you very much. It's a real joy to be here.